Citizens, friends, the spectacle we are witnessing today within the borders of our neighbor Uganda is nothing less than a grotesque charade, a total manipulation of the democratic spirit. I address you in this moment, not merely as a political figure, but as a son of this vast African soil who has watched this tragic scenario replay itself with exhausting frequency across our cherished continent. Permit me to expose the stark reality of the current situation transpiring within the Ugandan territory. The polls have closed. Yes, the citizenry has performed its duty, yet what plays out before our gaze is a meticulously choreographed larceny of the popular will. At this precise second, as my voice reaches you, the tallying of the ballots is underway. However, do not be deceived. The accounting currently taking place bears no resemblance to the authentic aspirations expressed by the Ugandan electorate. President Museveni, the patriarch who has grasped the reins of power since 1986, ruling for nearly 40 years, now boldly proclaims an anticipation of securing 88% of the suffrage. Can one truly conceive of such a figure in a pluralistic society, 88%? He asserts with a logic that defies reason that any result falling short of this landslide would constitute proof that the election was stolen from him. Here stands a man who has dominated the state for 4 decades, declaring that anything less than absolute hegemony is theft. I ask you in all conscience, who is truly the architect of this robbery? Standing in opposition, we find Bobi Wine and his coalition the voice of dissent. They maintain that the machinery of fraud was set in motion long before the first ballot was cast, visible yesterday and indeed in the days preceding the vote. Bobi Wine warns the population that liberty and fairness have been exiled from this electoral process. And truly, when one examines the grim reality on the terrain observing the climate in which this vote occurs, one is compelled by the evidence to concur with his assessment. Here begins the fabrication, the grand illusion. As the count proceeds, we observe the predictable ascent of Museveni to the lead. The official figures trickling out conveniently align with his prophecy, granting him the very victory margin he decreed. But I ask you, how can any credibility be attached to these statistics when the integrity of the entire mechanism was compromised from its very inception? Allow me to detail the draconian conditions that defined this electoral exercise. 2 days prior to the vote, the regime plunged the nation into digital silence, severing the internet completely. Yes, you have understood correctly. In the year 2025, a state apparatus has dared to disconnect an entire nation from the global network. They justify this censorship under the guise of security, claiming to halt misinformation, prevent fraud, and curb the incitement of violence. But let us be lucid when a government blinds the digital eye during an election. What truths are they so desperate to conceal in the shadows? For days, the Ugandan populace has been cast into an information abyss, unable to commune or coordinate with one another. Citizens are barred from sharing their observations from the polling stations, while the press finds itself shackled, unable to perform its sacred duty. Journalists are reduced to archaic methods, relying on telephone calls to reporters, as the transmission of live video has been rendered impossible. How can one claim transparency when the very arteries of modern communication have been severed by the state? This digital blackout has drawn the ire of human rights defenders globally, who rightly denounce it as a tactic of authoritarianism, a measure of repression. Their judgment is sound, for when a regime wishes to operate unseen to shield its machinations from the world's gaze, it first destroys the capacity for dialogue. This is precisely the strategy employed by the Ugandan administration. Turn your attention now to the act of voting itself, where we witnessed a significant abstention. The turnout was undeniably low. A vast number of citizens refused to participate, a silence that speaks volumes and demands our understanding. When the electorate loses faith in the sanctity of the process, when they perceive the result as preordained by the powers that be, they retreat into resignation. This is the tragedy we observed in Uganda. Participation dwindled because the people recognize this repetitive script. They have endured charades where, regardless of their action or their vote, the eternal incumbent remains immovable. Yet despite this desertion of the polls, Museveni audaciously anticipates capturing 88% of the ballots cast. He insists that if the count is conducted properly, a term he defines, he will inevitably secure this overwhelming mandate. Compatriots, does this logic hold even a shred of credibility in your minds? When the polling stations stand empty, how does the sitting power suddenly miraculously surge to heights greater than ever before? Permit me to relay the testimonies of Bobi Wine and his allies. They witnessed the brazen distribution of currency from vehicles bearing the ruling party's insignia. The ruling apparatus was engaging in the literal purchase of consciences at the very gates of the voting centers. They watched as their observers were expelled. How can one speak of fairness when the eyes of the opposition are forcibly blinded? Bobi Wine traveled personally to Kisenyi to bear witness to the unfolding events. There, he discovered a landscape of violence and intimidation, where citizens known to dissent were brutalized in the open street. Operatives of the regime sat in their vehicles dispensing cash with one hand, while unleashing violence upon any soul identified as opposition with the other. This is not democracy, my friends, it is the death of it. We are witnessing a charade, a brutal dictatorship, cloaking itself in the fragile vestments of democracy. Bobi Wine has issued a clarion call to the Ugandan citizenry, urging them to cast a vote of absolute defiance against this authoritarian regime. He perceives Yoweri Museveni not merely as a president, but as a feudal lord who views the nation of Uganda as his private patrimony, and its citizens as nothing more than subjects in servitude. And when one scrutinizes the deplorable manner in which this electoral process has been orchestrated, can one truly claim his assessment is incorrect? When a head of state unilaterally severs the digital lifeline of the internet, when he grants impunity to his loyalists to brutalize opposition voters, when he forcibly expels international election observers, and when he has the audacity to forecast his own percentage of victory before a single ballot is tallied, is this not the quintessential conduct of a man who believes he possesses the state itself? The campaign period itself was marred by a spectacle of violence from its very genesis to its conclusion. Mere weeks ago, precisely 1 month past, Bobi Wine was campaigning in the heart of the capital Kampala. On that fateful day, he was subjected to physical assault. His supporters were met with clouds of tear gas. This has been the unyielding motif throughout the entire campaign season, a triad of violence, intimidation, and systematic repression. And now, as the tabulation proceeds, we are expected to suspend our disbelief and accept that within this climate of terror and coercion, the populace freely elected to bestow upon Museveni 88% of their suffrages. Permit me to illuminate the irregularities that were documented well before the polls opened. The very integrity of the voter register was called into question by the opposition forces. They uncovered duplications, multiple registrations, and glaring inconsistencies permeating the list. How can one aspire to a fair election when the foundational role of voters is fundamentally compromised? Yet these grave concerns were dismissed with a wave of the hand. The election proceeded despite the flawed registry, and then in a stroke of administrative caprice, on the very day of voting, the regulations were altered. Citizens arrived at polling stations at the crack of dawn, acting under the impression that they would undergo biometric verification via fingerprint or iris scanning. This was the announced protocol. However, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the directives were suddenly and inexplicably reversed. Suddenly, every individual on the register was permitted to cast a ballot sans biometric verification. One must ask what prompted this abrupt pivot. Mes amis, when one alters the rules of engagement in the midst of the contest, it is undeniably because one seeks to manipulate the final result. Bobi Wine posed a critical interrogation that demands your profound reflection. He queried in a scenario where the internet is extinguished and the media is shackled by heavy censorship, how does one maintain a dialogue with supporters across the nation? How does one instruct the populace to revert to manual voting when the very means to disseminate that directive nationwide has been obliterated? Envision, if you will, that the opposition wished to issue a proclamation to the nation to urge a specific course of action. How could they possibly execute this within such an information void? This constitutes a grave existential threat to the concept of democracy. When you cannot converse with the people, when you cannot coordinate your sentinels, when you cannot transmit intelligence regarding events at disparate polling stations, how can the sanctity of the vote be preserved? At this precise moment, as the ballots are being tallied, we are witnessing Yoweri Museveni assume a commanding lead. The figures being released depict him triumphing by staggering margins. But do not be deceived, my brothers and sisters. These figures are a mirage. This is pure fabrication. This is the inevitable consequence when a single entity monopolizes the entirety of the electoral apparatus. When you sever communications, expel independent observers, alter regulations midstream, and terrorize the electorate, you possess the power to conjure whatever statistics you desire. Museveni himself has been discoursing on the subject of electoral theft, yet he has audaciously directed these accusations toward the opposition. Just this morning, he asserted that during the previous election in 2021, it was the opposition who pilfered votes. He claimed they secured 2.7 million votes through illicit means. By his logic, this was the rationale behind their use of marked ballot papers. And this, he argues, is the justification for the decision to transition to an electronic system for this election in 2025. However, many citizens are raising a hue and cry that this electronic infrastructure has failed to function with any degree of competence. They assert it has collapsed due to the absence of internet connectivity, and we must ask who was responsible for severing that connection. The government itself, operating through the Ministry of Communication, terminated internet access 2 days prior to the election. Let us be absolutely lucid about this. The administration dismantles the internet. Simultaneously, they decree that the election shall be conducted electronically. Consequently, the electronic system fails due to the connectivity void, and miraculously they produce results granting the president a victory of massive proportions. Do you perceive the machinations at play? Every maneuver in this process has been meticulously engineered to guarantee a singular denouement, Museveni remaining entrenched in power. The nation of Uganda has been plunged into darkness for these past several days. There has been a total digital blackout starting 2 days before the polls. Yesterday there was silence. Today the silence persists. Certain resourceful individuals have discovered circumventions using VPNs and other digital backchannels. Bobi Wine has managed to transmit sporadic updates. A fraction of his entourage has succeeded in smuggling information to the outside world. Thus, while the silence is not absolute, the vast majority of the Ugandan populace has been effectively severed from the global community and from one another during the most critical moment of their civic life. My brothers and sisters, we are witnessing Museveni's attempt to seize a 7th term in office. 4 decades, 40 long years. An entire generation of Ugandans has emerged from the cradle to adulthood without ever witnessing another face at the helm of the state. And yet his appetite remains unsated. He seeks yet another mandate. To continue until when? Until he draws his final breath within the presidential palace. Let us be clear, this is the antithesis of democracy. It is in truth a monarchy draping itself in the costume of a republic. Against this calcified regime stands Bobi Wine, born Robert Kyagulanyi Sentamu, who embodies a rupture with this stagnation. He signifies a profound hope for transformation, the desperate aspiration of a new generation yearning to take the reins of their own destiny. However, that fragile hope is currently being asphyxiated by the heavy machinery of a thoroughly compromised electoral apparatus. Every indicator from the very outset has signaled a grand orchestration of fraud by the Museveni regime, the extreme brutality during the campaign, the plunging of the nation into digital darkness. The arbitrary alteration of voting protocols, the intimidation of observers, a corrupted voter registry, and now these hallucinatory results placing the incumbent in the lead. Acting under the strict dictates of the executive, the Ugandan Ministry of Communication has successfully sealed the country within a hermetic communications blackout throughout this electoral period. They have effectively paralyzed the citizenry, making it impossible to coordinate to circulate vital information or to shine a light on the fraud occurring before their very eyes. And it is within this imposed obscurity, this deafening silence, that the regime is busy manufacturing the precise mathematical outcome it desires. Comrade citizens of Africa, I implore you to grasp the gravity of this moment. This tragedy extends far beyond the borders of Uganda. It concerns the soul of our entire continent. It poses the fundamental question, will we as Africans permit our leaders to treat us with such disdain, to pilfer our sovereignty, to trample our will, and to cling to power through coercion and artifice, rather than deriving their legitimacy from the genuine consent of the governed? The pressing question now is whether Museveni will be proclaimed the victor based on the phantasmagoria of figures currently being disseminated by the state media. The likelihood is high, yes, the announcement seems inevitable. But will he have secured this victory with honor? Will he have triumphed through honest means? My friends, the response is a resounding negative. 1,000 times no. If Museveni claims the presidency once more, it will not be because the Ugandan populace selected him to lead. It will be because he successfully hijacked the election through the systematic manipulation of every lever of state power. And if Bobi Wine falls, it is not because the people turned their backs on him. It is because the contest was sabotaged from the very opening move. I wish to hear your perspectives on this matter. In your estimation, who truly commands the heart and the loyalty of the Ugandan citizenry? And if the incumbent is crowned victor, do you believe his throne is built upon the pillars of truth or upon the quicksand of lies? Express your views, my brothers and sisters, for we must maintain our discourse even as they attempt to gag us. We shall scrutinize the situation with unyielding vigilance. We remain committed to reporting the reality on the ground, irrespective of the digital iron curtain that has descended upon Uganda. Even as the regime attempts to dam the river of information, we will discover tributaries through which the truth may flow. We shall continue to provide you with critical updates on every development until the final official declaration is made. And we will not hesitate to expose the nature of this accession to power, whether it arises from the sovereign voice of the people or from the dark arts of fabrication. My friends, this is our Africa. These are our kin, our flesh and blood. This is our collective struggle for liberty and democratic integrity. We cannot remain mute while witnessing the larceny of our Ugandan brothers and sisters' voices. We must not avert our gaze while an election is manufactured like a cheap product before us. We are morally bound to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people of Uganda. We must align ourselves with all Africans who are battling for the sacred right to determine their own leadership freely and without coercion. Even as I speak, the ballots are being tallied, yet the stream of fabricated statistics continues to flow, painting a picture of Museveni's extended dominance. But let us not be deceived, comrades. Figures scribbled on a sheet of paper possess no power to alter the fundamental reality. The reality is that the populace thirsted for change. The reality is that this electoral process was neither free nor equitable. The undeniable truth is that what we are observing is not the practice of democracy, but the consolidation of dictatorship. No quantity of manufactured results can erase these facts. Remain resilient, Uganda. Stand firm, Africa. The struggle is far from over, and we shall not be silenced. We refuse to accept this pilfering of democracy. We will continue to raise our voices until the day comes when they can no longer be suppressed. We will continue to speak until our voices can no longer be silenced.